Welcome to Sacred Cow Shipyards, where no ship is safe from being taken down to its nuts and bolts. So as it turns out, my ladies and germs, I lied to you last week, and for that I apologize. It was not actually an intentional lie, it was not a deliberate lie, and it sure as hell was not a malicious lie. I just cannot keep track of my own schedule to keep my tiny little life straight, so things like this kind of happen. Like I said last week, you got a twofer episode of kind of your real world stories about the whole, forklift and the whole, row on fire problem that you were currently having. I don't know. I record these episodes so far in advance, I'm not sure what's going on in your time span right now. The point is, I've got shit going on, and I'm going to have to record a couple of episodes ahead. So I'm going to take the easy way out and do your real world stuff at least once, maybe twice. We'll see, just because it's easier that way. And let's face it, you're going to watch this stuff anyway, so I'm just going to do as I please, and well, like I said, you're going to watch it. So it turns out that y'all need some education on some damage control shit. And specifically in fires, because fires have a tendency of happening all over the goddamn place, so let's start there. So, fires. Y'all understand fires. I mean, it's kind of a fundamental aspect of your development as a species. In fact, your mythology considers fires so important that the gods literally stapled the dude who gave you fire to the side of a mountain so some vulture or eagle or something could eat out his liver every single day. Apparently he was a demigod himself and the liver regenerated, and it was all just uncomfortable and painful for everyone involved, but hey, y'all got fire out of the process, so that's a win, right? Anywho, like I said in the last episode, most of y'all, probably all of y'all, were brought up to believe that fire is a triangle for some weird reason. It's not technically wrong, but it's not entirely correct either, and we'll get to why in just a minute. So, naturally, one of those legs of the triangle is the fuel, the stuff that's actually burning. The wood, the oil, you, because actually humans burn pretty well, but still, you need something that is expending energy and being oxidized in the process, and I pretty much just telegraphed the other two legs, but bear with me for just a moment. Then, aside from the actual thing that is actually burning, you do need actual oxygen, or something that can oxidize what is going on. Now, there's an important distinction there, because oxygen is not always actually relevant to fires. Some fires are self-oxidizing, and that's a whole different conversation that we'll get to eventually. And finally, you need the heat. There's no such thing as a cold fire. There might be such a thing as a cold fusion. Good luck on that endeavor. But there is no such thing as a cold fire. So there's heat. You are using heat to liberate energy out of stuff, which is making more heat. And that's how fires work. So that's the three parts of the fundamental fire triangle that most of y'all were taught. And frankly, if you weren't taught that, your parents failed you, but I understand that's a common problem for your species, so I apologize. The thing is, to get us back to our original point, is that fires are not a two-dimensional thing, as I am sure most of y'all who have been around a campfire are aware of, and that's not actually the point I'm trying to make. The concept of a fire is not two-dimensional. It's actually three-dimensional. It's not a triangle, it's a tetrahedron, and we're not talking about edges, we're talking about sides. So imagine that the three edges we were just talking about are also three sides of a tetrahedron. And if anyone in the audience can count, tetrahedrons have four sides. So the last side is uninhibited chemical chain reaction. This is where stuff gets weird. So imagine a wood fire. You have free atmosphere oxygen available. It's already hot courtesy of the fire, and it already has fuel courtesy of the wood. The uninhibited chemical chain reaction is the successive release of energy from the wood itself. Because, wood's just sitting there. It's basically, what's the term? It's just full of potential energy, not actual kinetic energy, which, if any fire is fundamentally kinetic energy. Once you get right down to it, the molecules are moving really, really fast. But if you can stop the molecules from moving really, really fast, you can stop the fire. Because that is the uninhibited chemical reaction, is the reaction of all of the components in the fuel turning into heat and fire. And yes, I understand that there's a very weird distinction between the uninhibited chemical reaction and the heat concept. There are some steps involved where the wood, like off gases, flammable materials, and things happen in there. I'm skipping over a lot of specific details just to try to make this easier for you, but the fundamental takeaway is that your concept of fire has evolved over the years, and your concept of firefighting has likewise evolved also. So let's look at why. So first off, we have to categorize fires, right? I mean, not all fires are the same, as anyone who's ever cooked in one of your humid kitchens would know. And that totally doesn't lead us to the first categorization of fire, known as an alpha class fire. Alpha fires, or A fires, are basically anything dry or not oiled or not electrical that can burn. So we're talking about like paper, wood, cloth, that kind of stuff. If that kind of stuff catches fire, it's an alpha class fire. And the easy way to put an alpha class fire out is basically anything. You can use water, you can use CO2, you can use halon, you can use AFFF, you can use whatever you want. You can even smother it in a blanket if it's a small enough fire. And these are all different things that affect different parts of the fire tetrahedron. And this is where your cute little quaint notion of stop, drop, and roll actually works. What you're doing if you were to catch on fire and you were to stop, drop, and roll is depriving the fire of its oxidizer, its oxygen, mostly from the atmosphere. And that will put out the fire. You're also having an ancillary effect of spreading the heat around a little on the surface that you're rolling on, but mostly you're just cutting off the oxygen. And that's how fire blankets work as well. If you can toss any kind of thick enough blanket over any kind of fire of, small enough size, you'll probably put it out just because it's going to suffocate before it can burn through the blanket. And this is basically how AFFF, or aqueous film forming foam, works as well. It's a foam that is sprayed on a fire, and the foam makes a film that functionally acts as a blanket. It deprives the fire of oxygen, which naturally leads us to the class Bravo fire. You don't want one of those. Bravo fires, or B fires, are what happens when a flammable liquid catches on fire. Now, most of y'all squishy humans will encounter this in the kitchen if you ever accidentally get your grease on fire. Yeah, well, that's easy to control. Put a lid on it. Cut off the oxygen. Alternatively, do you know the worst thing to do for a Bravo fire and something that works just fine for an alpha fire? Yeah, use water. Water will put out an alpha fire pretty darn quick. It will make a Bravo fire spread because all you're doing is hitting the flammable liquid with another liquid. And when you mix liquids, they kind of just splash all over the place, don't they? Do you want flaming liquid splashing all over the place? Of course you fucking don't. Don't use water for Bravo fires. The funny thing is, well, it's not funny in like the ha-ha sense, but it's still funny. The funny thing is that Bravo fires actually kind of like prompted your species to determine like how fires work and how best to cut them off without, spreading them around by spraying water on them. And this led to the development of things like AFFF, aqueous film forming foam. Again, if you can knock out any side of that tetrahedron, you're a win. Alternatively, there's purple K, or PKP, which is a purple powder that is so fine you cannot even imagine. It is so very, very fine. It gets into every goddamn thing. But the useful thing that it does is it knocks out that uncontrolled chemical reaction part of the tetrahedron. So, yeah, you're not spreading the fire around by spraying this powder on top of it. You're just stopping it from happening. And in a related concept, halon also does the same thing, which is why halon is probably one of the most common methods of putting out fires on a lot of ships these days. Mostly because it's not technically lethal to use humie squishies, and it puts out fires pretty well, even though a lot of different halon variants have been outlawed by your idiotic governments. The final easy way of putting out a Class Bravo fire is butt tons of CO2. And this is where it gets a little complicated. Because as I'm sure you walnuts are aware, CO2 will put out a fire, right? It'll also put out you. So the funny thing is, most of your home fire extinguishers are CO2 extinguishers. They're meant for limited uses. They're meant to like put out a pan fire or something. But there are like space suppression CO2 systems, where if a fire happens in this space, well, the CO2 system deploys and good fucking luck for everyone inside. And realistically, I'm not even joking. There are systems and spaces on your military vehicles where it is better to sacrifice the humies that are in that space than to let that space catch on fire right proper and explosive. So when things go wrong, the humies are given an alarm and given a timer, and they have to get out of that space in that time. And if they don't, well, that sucks. The most obvious example frequently are torpedo rooms for surface ships, because you see the problem is torpedo fuel self-oxidizes. Once it catches on fire, it will keep itself on fire because it can oxidize itself. So the whole point for the CO2 system for surface ships is to limit how much oxidation there is going on. Now, obviously, that will not put out the fire because, like I said, torpedo fuel is self-oxidizing. But it will narrow the field you have to work in. There's not going to be atmosphere helping the fire continue because the atmosphere actively wants the fire to go out. And those complications don't stop there because now we are into the world of Charlie-class fires. Actually, honestly, Charlie-class fires are pretty easy. They are caused by electrical, systems failing massively. So the easy way to put them out, cut off the electricity, because the electricity is making the heat, which is causing the fire. So, turn off the electricity. The heat will go out. Fire will go out. Everybody's happy. At least everyone's happy until you release a PKP or a AFFF fire extinguisher on a Class Charlie fire, because both of those things eat, all of the metals that you use for electricity conduction, actively. They devour those metals. It's really bad. Don't use PKP or AFFF for an electrical fire. You'll make a lot of people very angry if you do. You might put out the fire. Good for you. It would have been better just to, turn off the electricity. And speaking of metals, that brings us to Class Delta fires. There's a saying in your United States Navy that all Class Delta fires go over the side one way or the other. Because once a metal starts burning, and yes, Class Delta fires are metal fires, once a metal starts burning, it burns for a really, really, really long time. In fact, your entire planet's militaries have optimized the notion of burning metals. They're called thermite. And yes, they burn through basically everything. It's really bad news. On the ground, if you're lucky and you bury it in enough sand, eventually the fire will go out. On the ocean, it goes over the side, or it burns through all the decks and levels on the ship until it comes out the bottom of the ship, and then it goes over the side anyways, right? Like I said, it goes over the side one way or the other. And no, there is fundamentally no other way to fight a Class Delta fire. You toss it over, or, well, you're basically fucked. Alright, fine. So how does this all relate to science fiction stories and other such nonsense like that? Well, if you are paying attention to the original fire triangle and or tetrahedron, there is a very simple way for science fiction ships to put out a fire. You vent the space to, space! And that fundamentally solves the oxidizer problem. Now, the problem is, as we have talked about previously, space is not a very good thermal conductor. So yes, you might vent out the oxidizer and then close the space back up again and repressurize it, and then the fire breaks out anew because the metal is still hot or something. So you've got to think about that. Also, there is a small problem of, humi survivability when you vent the space, but hey, it's just a small problem and you'll get over it eventually. But aside from that, firefighting on a spaceship, is no joke hard. You're not going to have excesses of water just laying around that you can spray the fire with. And you will have excesses of CO2 laying around that you could flood the chamber with or the space with, but that's not any better or worse than just venting the space to space. You're still filling it with something that will kill your humies and will put out the fire, but then you have to clean up afterwards. You have to reclaim that CO2 or repressurize that vacuum. And things like PKP or AFFF are deliberately designed to get everywhere. That's the whole point of them, is they're supposed to be a fire suppression method. And neither of them are very friendly for electronics, so if you were to release them into a space without, say, securing the ventilation, it'll get sucked into the ventilation, then spread everywhere, and everywhere is not where you want it to go. And even if you do manage to secure the ventilation before you release these chemicals, I guarantee you there are things in that space that you don't want to have those chemicals hit. And then, on top of all of that, fires in space by themselves are fundamentally complicated. If your ship is not under thrust or does not have artificial gravity by some other fashion, fires are spheres. Yeah, it's fucking weird. So yeah, any gravity well-born member of your crew is going to be thinking, oh yeah, the fire is going to go up, the smoke is going to go up, obviously we're going to go down, right, to avoid all that. Well, no, the fire spreads spherically, the smoke spreads spherically. This is all really complicated. Zero gravity is a problem for a lot of different things. I mean, hell, you can't even smother a fire with a fire blanket in space at microgravity because there's nothing holding the blanket onto the fire. It'll just bounce off whatever the fire's on and then float away, and then the fire will continue. So yeah, your best solutions for fighting fire in space are a compartment level solution where you void the space or you saturate it with CO2 or some other inert gas that disallows the fire from happening. But then you have to bear in mind that there might be crew members in there, and well, you might be killing them. So what is it worth to you to put out the fire? Welcome to the wonderful world of damage control, where the cost-benefit analysis involves lives. Enjoy your stay. And that's all from Sacred Cow Shipyards. Please be advised that any ship left on the dock for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Have a nice day.